house next door had always been a mystery. It was an old Victorian-style home with peeling paint, overgrown ivy crawling up its walls, and a sagging porch that seemed to groan under the weight of time. For years, it had stood empty, a relic of a bygone era, until one day, someone moved in. You first noticed the figure on a crisp autumn evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street, and as you pulled into your driveway, you saw it. A silhouette in the upstairs window of the neighbor's house. The figure was motionless, standing just behind the curtain, its face obscured by the dim light. You waved, more out of habit than anything else, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there watching. At first, you didn't think much of it. Maybe the new neighbor was shy, or perhaps they were just getting settled in. But as the days turned into weeks, the figure became a constant presence. Every morning, as you left for work, it was there, standing in the same window. Every evening, when you returned, it was still there, as if it hadn't moved an inch. You tried to convince yourself that it was just your imagination, that the figure wasn't really watching you. But then, one night, as you were closing your curtains, you saw it again. This time, the figure was in a different window, closer to the front of the house. You froze, your heart pounding in your chest. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge you in any way. You just stood there, staring. The next day, you decided to introduce yourself. You walked up to the neighbor's house, your footsteps crunching on the gravel path, and knocked on the door. There was no answer. You knocked again, louder this time, but still there was no response. You peered through the window, but the house was dark, and you couldn't see anything inside. Feeling uneasy, you decided to ask around the neighborhood. But no one seemed to know anything about the new neighbor. No one had seen anyone moving in. No one had seen anyone coming or going. It was as if the figure had simply appeared out of thin air. That night, as you lay in bed, you couldn't shake the feeling that you were being watched. You got up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The figure was there, in the same window as before, its silhouette stark against the dim light. You quickly closed the curtain, your heart racing. The next morning, you decided to take matters into your own hands. You walked over to the neighbor's house again, this time with a flashlight in hand. You tried the door, but it was locked. You walked around to the back of the house, where you found a window that was slightly ajar. You pushed it open and climbed inside. The house was eerily quiet, the air thick with dust. You shone your flashlight around the room, but there was no sign of the figure. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the floors were bare. It looked as if no one had lived there for years. You made your way upstairs, your footsteps echoing in the empty house. When you reached the room where you had seen the figure, you paused. The door was slightly open, and you could see the curtain fluttering in the breeze. You pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty. You shone your flashlight around, but there was no one there. The window was open, and the curtain was moving, but there was no sign of the figure. You walked over to the window and looked out. Your house was just across the street, and you could see your own window from here. You realized with a sinking feeling that the figure had been watching you from this very spot. You quickly left the house, your mind racing. Who or what was the figure? And why was it watching you? The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of unease. The figure in the window became a constant presence in your life, a shadow that lingered at the edge of your thoughts. You tried to convince yourself that it was nothing, that your mind was playing tricks on you, but deep down you knew better. The figure was real and it was watching you. You began to notice other strange things. At night, you would hear faint noises coming from the neighbor's house, soft footsteps, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of curtains. You would look out your window, but the house would be dark, the figure nowhere to be seen. Yet, the sounds persisted, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. One evening, as you were preparing dinner, you felt a chill run down your spine. You turned around, and there it was, the figure standing in your kitchen. It was just a silhouette, dark and featureless, but you could feel its gaze on you, cold and unyielding. Your heart skipped a beat, and you dropped the knife you were holding. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the silence. You blinked and the figure was gone. You stood there, frozen, your mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had you imagined it? But no, the feeling of being watched was still there, lingering in the air like a bad smell. You quickly finished preparing your dinner, your hands trembling, and ate in silence, your eyes darting to the kitchen doorway every few seconds. That night, you couldn't sleep. You lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, your mind racing. Who or what was the figure? And why was it in your house? You thought about calling the police, but what would you say? That a shadowy figure was watching you from the neighbor's house? They would think you were crazy. The next morning, you decided to do some research. You went to the local library and dug through old newspapers, looking for any information about the house next door. It didn't take long to find what you were looking for. The house had a history. 50 years ago, a family had lived there, a husband, wife, and their young daughter. One night, the husband had gone mad, claiming that he was being watched by an unseen presence. He had locked himself in the upstairs room, refusing to come out. His wife had tried to reason with him, but he had become violent, accusing her of being in league with the watcher. In a fit of rage, he had killed her and then himself. The daughter had disappeared that night, never to be seen again. You felt a chill as you read the article. The house had been empty ever since, until now. You wondered if the figure you had seen was the ghost of the husband, still trapped in the house, still watching, waiting. That evening, as you were getting ready for bed, you heard a knock at your door. You froze, your heart pounding. The knock came again, louder this time. You walked to the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. You opened the door cautiously, the cool night air brushing against your face. The street was empty, the neighbor's house dark and silent. You stepped outside, looking around, but there was no sign of anyone. As you turned to go back inside, you noticed something on your doorstep, a small, crumpled piece of paper. You picked it up and unfolded it. The message was written in a shaky, almost childlike handwriting. "Help me." You felt a cold sweat break out on your forehead. You looked around again, but the street was still empty. You went back inside, locking the door behind you. You sat down on the couch, the note in your hand, your mind racing. Who had left it? And what did they want from you? The next day, you decided to investigate further. You went back to the neighbor's house, determined to find some answers. This time, you brought a crowbar with you just in case. You tried the door again, but it was still locked. You walked around to the back of the house and found the same window you had climbed through before. It was still slightly ajar. You climbed inside, the crowbar in hand, and made your way upstairs. The house was just as empty as before, the air thick with dust. You went to the room where you had seen the figure, but it was still empty. You shone your flashlight around, looking for any clues, but there was nothing. As you were about to leave, you noticed something on the floor, a small, dusty doll. It was old, its face cracked and worn, but you could still make out the features. It looked like a child's doll, the kind that might have belonged to the daughter who had disappeared all those years ago. You picked it up, feeling a strange sense of sadness. What had happened to the girl? Had she escaped, or had she met a worse fate? As you were leaving the house, you heard a faint whisper, so soft that you almost missed it. You froze, your heart pounding. The whisper came again, louder this time, "Help me." You turned around, but there was no one there. The house was empty, just as it had been before. But the whisper had been real, you were sure of it. You quickly left the house, the doll in your hand, and went back to your own home. That night, as you lay in bed, you couldn't shake the feeling that you were being watched. You got up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The figure was there, in the same window as before, its silhouette stark against the dim light. But this time, it wasn't alone. Next to it, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure of a young girl. The sight of the two figures in the window sent a shiver down your spine. The girl's silhouette was faint, almost translucent, as if she were made of mist. She stood slightly behind the larger figure, her head tilted as though she were listening to something. You stared, unable to look away, your heart pounding in your chest. Then, as if sensing your gaze, the girl turned her head and looked directly at you. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and filled with a sadness that made your breath catch. She raised a hand, her fingers trembling, and pointed at you. The gesture was unmistakable, she was asking for your help. You stumbled back from the window, your mind racing. The doll you had found in the house felt heavy in your hands, as if it carried the weight of the girl's sorrow. You placed it on your nightstand, unable to shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to her. That night, you barely slept, haunted by the image of the girl's pleading eyes and the silent figure standing beside her. The next morning, you decided to dig deeper into the history of the house and the family who had lived there. You returned to the library, determined to find out what had happened to the daughter. After hours of searching through old records and newspapers, you finally found a small, almost forgotten article from decades ago. The girl's name was Emily. She had been 7 years old when her father had killed her mother and then himself. According to the article, Emily had vanished that same night, and despite an extensive search, no trace of her had ever been found. The case had eventually gone cold and the house had been left abandoned, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. As you read the article, a sense of dread settled over you. If Emily had never been found, what had happened to her? And why was her ghost, or whatever it was, appearing to you now? That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, you found yourself standing in front of the neighbor's house once again. The doll was in your pocket, a strange comfort as you approached the old, creaking porch. This time, the front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting you inside. You hesitated, your hand gripping the crowbar tightly, but you knew you couldn't turn back now. The house was darker than before, the air thick with an oppressive silence. You stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under your weight. Your flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the same dusty, empty rooms you had seen before. But something felt different this time. The air was colder, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like the sound of distant whispers. You made your way upstairs, your footsteps echoing in the stillness. When you reached the room where you had seen the figures, you paused. The door was closed, but you could feel a presence on the other side. You took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But the air was heavy, charged with an energy that made your skin crawl. You stepped inside, your flashlight sweeping across the walls. That's when you noticed it. A small, faint handprint on the window pane. It was too small to belong to an adult, and it looked fresh, as if it had been made recently. You reached out to touch it, but before your fingers could make contact, the room suddenly grew colder. Your breath came out in visible puffs, and the hum you had heard earlier grew louder, more distinct. It was no longer a whisper. It was a voice, soft and pleading. "Help me." You spun around, your flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was still empty, but the voice had been unmistakable. It was the voice of a child. "Emily?" You called out, your voice trembling. "Is that you?" There was no response, but the air seemed to shift, as if something, or someone, was moving around you. You felt a cold hand brush against your arm, and you jerked back, your heart racing. The flashlight slipped from your grasp and clattered to the floor, its beam flickering before going out. Panic surged through you as you fumbled for the flashlight, but before you could reach it, the room was filled with a faint, bluish light. It emanated from the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to deepen. You squinted, trying to make out what was causing the light, and then you saw her. Emily! She was standing in the corner, her form faint and translucent, her dark eyes fixed on you. She looked just as she had in the window, her expression filled with a desperate sadness. She raised her hand again, pointing at you, and then slowly turned and pointed to the floor. You followed her gaze and noticed a loose floorboard. Your hands trembling, you knelt down and pried it open. Beneath it was a small, dusty box. You lifted it out and opened it, revealing a collection of old, yellowed papers and a small, tattered photograph. The photograph was of Emily and her parents, taken before the tragedy. They looked happy, their smiles genuine and carefree. The papers were letters written in the same shaky handwriting as the note you had found on your doorstep. They were addressed to Emily's mother, filled with apologies and confessions of guilt. The last letter was different, it was addressed to Emily herself. "My dearest Emily, I am so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I only wanted to protect you from the Watcher. But I failed. I failed you, and now you are lost. Forgive me, my child. Forgive me." Your hands shook as you read the words. The Watcher. The figure in the window. It all made sense now. Emily's father had been driven mad by the presence of the Watcher, and in his madness he had tried to protect his daughter. But something had gone terribly wrong. You looked up at Emily, who was still standing in the corner, her eyes filled with tears. "What happened to you?" you whispered. "What do you need me to do?" Emily's form flickered, and for a moment you thought she might disappear. But then she stepped forward, her hand reaching out to you. Her fingers brushed against the doll in your pocket, and you understood. She wanted to be free. The realization hit you like a thunderclap. Emily wasn't just trapped in the house, she was trapped by the Watcher. The figure you had seen in the window, the one that had appeared in your kitchen, was the same presence that had driven her father to madness. It was the Watcher, and it had been holding her captive for decades. You looked down at the doll in your hands, its cracked face staring up at you with an eerie stillness. Emily's ghostly form flickered again, her hand still outstretched, her eyes pleading. You didn't know how to free her, but you knew you had to try. "I'll help you," you said softly, your voice trembling. "I'll find a way." Emily's form wavered, and for a moment you thought she might speak. But instead, she simply nodded, her expression filled with gratitude. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving you alone in the cold, silent room. You gathered the letters and the photograph, placing them carefully back in the box. The doll felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of Emily's soul. You tucked it into your pocket and left the house, the air outside feeling strangely warm compared to the icy chill inside. That night, you couldn't sleep. The events of the day played over and over in your mind, and every time you closed your eyes, you saw Emily's hollow, pleading gaze. You needed to find a way to help her, but you had no idea where to start. The Watcher was a mystery, a presence that seemed to defy explanation. How could you fight something you didn't understand? The next morning, you decided to seek help. You drove to the next town over, where you had heard there was a woman who specialized in the paranormal. Her name was Margaret, and she was known for her ability to communicate with spirits. You weren't sure if you believed in such things, but you were desperate. Margaret's house was a small, cozy cottage on the edge of town. She greeted you at the door, her sharp eyes studying you with an intensity that made you feel as though she could see right through you. You explained everything. The figure in the window, the doll, the letters, and Emily's ghost. Margaret listened in silence, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When you finished, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her. "The Watcher," she said slowly, "is a malevolent spirit, one that feeds on fear and despair. It attaches itself to places where great tragedy has occurred, trapping the souls of those who died there. Emily's father was driven mad by its presence, and now it holds her captive. How do I free her?" you asked, your voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "It won't be easy. The Watcher is powerful, and it won't give up its hold without a fight. But there is a way. You'll need to perform a ritual, one that will sever its connection to the house and release Emily's soul." She explained the ritual in detail, her voice calm and steady. You would need to gather several items: a silver bell, a white candle, a vial of holy water, and a lock of hair from someone who had passed on. The ritual would need to be performed at midnight, in the room where Emily's spirit was strongest. "But be warned," Margaret said, her tone grave. "The Watcher will try to stop you. It will use every trick at its disposal to frighten you, to make you doubt yourself. You must stay strong no matter what happens. If you falter, it will consume you." You left Margaret's house with a sense of determination, but also a growing fear. The ritual sounded simple enough, but you knew it would be anything but. The Watcher was a force of darkness, and you were just one person. Could you really stand against it? That evening, you gathered the items Margaret had told you to find. The silver bell was easy enough, you had one in your own home. The white candle and holy water were purchased from a local church. The lock of hair was more difficult, but you managed to obtain one from an elderly neighbor who had recently lost her husband. As midnight approached, you made your way back to the neighbor's house. The air was thick with tension, and the house seemed to loom larger in the darkness, its windows like empty eyes watching your every move. You climbed through the open window once again, the items clutched tightly in your hands. The house was silent, but you could feel the Watcher's presence, a heavy, oppressive weight that pressed down on you as you made your way upstairs. The room where Emily's spirit had appeared was colder than ever, the air so thick it was hard to breathe. You set the items on the floor, arranging them as Margaret had instructed. You lit the white candle, its flame flickering weakly in the darkness. You rang the silver bell, its clear, high tone cutting through the silence. Then, you sprinkled the holy water around the room, whispering the words Margaret had taught you. By the light of this flame, by the sound of this bell, by the power of this water, I banish thee, Watcher. Release the soul you hold captive. Let her be free. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the room grew colder, the candle flame flickering wildly. The air seemed to vibrate, and a low, guttural growl filled the room. You felt a presence behind you, and you turned to see the Watcher. It was taller than you had imagined, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It reached for you, its fingers long and claw-like, and you stumbled back, your heart pounding. But you didn't falter. You rang the bell again, its tone clear and strong. "Release her!" you shouted, your voice trembling but firm. "Let her go!" The Watcher's form wavered, its grin faltering. It let out a roar of anger, the sound echoing through the room. But you stood your ground, ringing the bell again and again, the sound piercing through the darkness. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the Watcher vanished. The room fell silent, the air warm once more. The candle flame steadied, casting a soft, golden light. You looked around, your breath coming in ragged gasps. And then you saw her, Emily. She was standing in the corner, her form no longer faint and translucent. She looked real, solid, her eyes filled with gratitude. She smiled at you, a smile that was both sad and joyful, and then she began to fade. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and clear, and then she was gone. You sank to the floor, your legs giving out beneath you. The room was quiet, the air still. The Watcher was gone and Emily was free. But as you sat there, catching your breath, you couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching you. The days that followed were a blur. You returned to your home, exhausted but relieved, believing that the nightmare was finally over. The house next door stood silent and empty, its windows dark, its presence no longer looming over you like a specter. You told yourself that the Watcher was gone, that Emily was at peace, and that life could return to normal. But it didn't. At first, the signs were subtle. You would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was in the room with you. The air would feel heavy, oppressive, and you would hear faint whispers, so soft that you couldn't make out the words. You told yourself it was just your imagination, the lingering effects of what you had been through. But deep down, you knew better. The Watcher was still there. It wasn't as strong as before, but its presence was undeniable. You could feel it in the corners of your home, in the shadows that seemed to stretch just a little too far, in the way the air would grow cold for no reason. It was as if the ritual had weakened it but hadn't destroyed it completely. And now it was clinging to you, feeding off your fear. You tried to ignore it, to push it out of your mind, but it was impossible. Every night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Every night, the shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of your eye. And every night, you would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that the Watcher was standing at the foot of your bed. You knew you couldn't go on like this. You needed to finish what you had started, to banish the Watcher once and for all. But you didn't know how. The ritual had been your only hope, and it hadn't been enough. Desperate, you returned to Margaret. She listened to your story with a grave expression, her eyes narrowing as you described the Watcher's lingering presence. "It's not uncommon," she said finally. "Malevolent spirits like the Watcher are difficult to destroy completely. They cling to the living, feeding off their fear and despair. The ritual weakened it, but it wasn't enough to sever its connection to this world." "What can I do?" you asked, your voice trembling. "I can't live like this." Margaret leaned forward, her gaze intense. "There is one way," she said slowly, "but it's dangerous. You'll need to confront the Watcher directly, to face it in its own realm. Only then can you destroy it completely." "Its own realm?" you repeated, your heart sinking. "How do I do that?" Margaret explained that the Watcher existed in a kind of limbo, a shadowy realm between the living world and the afterlife. To reach it, you would need to perform another ritual, one that would allow you to cross over. But once you were there, you would be vulnerable. The Watcher would be at its strongest, and it would do everything in its power to stop you. "If you succeed," Margaret said, "the Watcher will be destroyed and its hold on this world will be broken. But if you fail," she trailed off, her expression grim. You didn't need her to finish the sentence. "If you failed, you would be trapped in the Watcher's realm, just like Emily had been." That night, you prepared for the ritual. Margaret had given you a list of items you would need: a black candle, a mirror, a piece of obsidian, and a drop of your own blood. You gathered them carefully, your hands trembling as you lit the black candle and placed it in front of the mirror. The obsidian felt cold and heavy in your hand, its surface smooth and reflective. You pricked your finger with a needle, letting a single drop of blood fall onto the obsidian. Then you began the ritual, chanting the words Margaret had taught you. By the blood of my veins, by the light of this flame, I call upon the shadows to reveal the path. Take me to the realm of the Watcher, that I may face it and destroy it. The room grew colder, the air thick with tension. The candle flame flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. You stared into the mirror, your reflection wavering as the glass seemed to ripple like water. And then, with a sudden, gut-wrenching lurch, you felt yourself being pulled forward. The world around you dissolved into darkness, and for a moment you were falling, weightless and disoriented. Then, with a jolt, you landed on solid ground. You were in the Watcher's realm. The world around you was a twisted, nightmarish version of the house next door. The walls were black and slick as if coated in oil, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The shadows seemed to move on their own, writhing and twisting like living things. In the distance, you could hear faint, guttural whispers, growing louder as you moved forward. You clutched the obsidian tightly, its cold surface grounding you as you made your way through the house. The Watcher was here, you could feel it, its presence like a weight pressing down on you. You needed to find it, to confront it, but you had no idea where to start. As you walked, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were calling your name, their voices filled with malice and mockery. You tried to ignore them, to focus on your goal, but it was impossible. The Watcher was playing with you, trying to break your resolve. Then you saw it. The Watcher stood at the end of the hallway, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It reached for you, its fingers long and claw-like, and you stumbled back, your heart pounding. But you didn't falter. You held up the obsidian, its surface reflecting the Watcher's twisted form. "You don't belong here," you said, your voice trembling but firm. "You're not welcome in this world or any other. I banish you, Watcher. I banish you." The Watcher let out a roar of anger, its form wavering as it lunged toward you. You held your ground, the obsidian glowing with a faint, bluish light. The Watcher's claws slashed at you, but they passed harmlessly through the air, as if repelled by some unseen force. You repeated the words, louder this time, your voice filled with determination. "I banish you, Watcher. I banish you." The Watcher's form began to dissolve, its screams echoing through the house as it was pulled apart, piece by piece. The shadows around you writhed and twisted, the walls of the house cracking and crumbling. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the Watcher was gone. The world around you dissolved into darkness once more, and you felt yourself falling, weightless and disoriented. Then, with a jolt, you landed back in your own home. You were lying on the floor, the black candle extinguished, the mirror cracked. The obsidian was still in your hand, its surface now dull and lifeless. You sat up, your breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked around. The house was quiet, the air warm and still. The shadows were just shadows, the whispers gone. The Watcher was no more. But as you sat there, catching your breath, you couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching you. The days that followed were a strange mix of relief and unease. The Watcher was gone, you were sure of it. The oppressive presence that had haunted you for weeks had vanished, and the house next door stood silent and empty, its windows dark and lifeless. You told yourself that it was over, that you could finally move on. But the feeling of being watched never quite went away. At first, you tried to ignore it. You told yourself it was just your imagination, the lingering effects of everything you had been through. But the feeling persisted, a faint, almost imperceptible sensation that prickled at the back of your neck. You would catch yourself glancing over your shoulder, scanning the shadows, half expecting to see the Watcher's glowing eyes staring back at you. You tried to distract yourself, to focus on the mundane tasks of everyday life. But no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking just out of sight. One night, as you were lying in bed, you heard a faint knock at your door. Your heart skipped a beat, and you sat up, your eyes darting to the clock. It was past midnight. Who could be knocking at this hour? You hesitated, your mind racing. The knock came again, louder this time, and you forced yourself to get up. You grabbed the obsidian from your nightstand, its cold surface a small comfort as you made your way to the door. You peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. The street was empty, the neighbor's house dark and silent. You opened the door cautiously, the cool night air brushing against your face. The porch was empty, but as you stepped outside, you noticed something on the doorstep, a small, crumpled piece of paper. You picked it up and unfolded it, your hands trembling. The message was written in the same shaky, childlike handwriting as before, "Thank you." You felt a chill run down your spine. Emily. It had to be her. But how? She was free, wasn't she? You had seen her fade away, her spirit finally at peace. Or had you? You went back inside, locking the door behind you. You sat down on the couch, the note in your hand, your mind racing. Was Emily still here, somehow? Or was this something else, something worse? The next day, you decided to visit Margaret one last time. You needed answers, and she was the only person who might be able to give them to you. When you arrived at her cottage, she greeted you with a knowing look as if she had been expecting you. "It's not over, is it?" she said before you could even speak. You shook your head, handing her the note. She studied it carefully, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "Emily's spirit is free," she said finally. "But the Watcher, it left something behind. A fragment of its power, a shadow of its presence. It's weak, but it's still there, clinging to you." "How do I get rid of it?" you asked, your voice trembling. Margaret sighed. "It's not that simple. The Watcher's shadow is tied to you now. It feeds off your fear, your doubt. The only way to destroy it is to confront it, to face it head on. But this time, you'll be on your own." That night, you prepared yourself for the final confrontation. You lit a white candle, its flame flickering weakly in the darkness, and sat down in the center of your living room. You closed your eyes, focusing on your breathing, trying to calm your racing heart. The room grew colder, the air thick with tension. You could feel the Watcher's shadow, a faint, almost imperceptible presence in the corner of the room. It was weak, but it was there, waiting. You opened your eyes and looked directly at it. "I'm not afraid of you," you said, your voice steady. "You have no power over me." The shadow shifted, its form wavering as it moved closer. You could feel its presence, cold and malevolent, but you didn't falter. You held up the obsidian, its surface reflecting the faint light of the candle. "You're nothing," you said, your voice growing stronger. "You're just a shadow, a fragment of something that's already gone. You don't belong here." The shadow let out a low, guttural growl, its form twisting and writhing as it lunged toward you. But you stood your ground, the obsidian glowing with a faint, bluish light. The shadow's claws slashed at you, but they passed harmlessly through the air, as if repelled by some unseen force. You repeated the words, louder this time, your voice filled with determination. "You're nothing. You don't belong here." The shadow began to dissolve, its form crumbling into nothingness as it was pulled apart, piece by piece. The room grew warmer, the air lighter, and with a final, ear-splitting scream, the shadow was gone. You sank to the floor, your legs giving out beneath you. The room was quiet, the air still. The Watcher's shadow was no more. You sat there for a long time, catching your breath, the obsidian still clutched in your hand. The feeling of being watched was gone, replaced by a sense of peace you hadn't felt in weeks. You knew it was over, truly over. As you lay down to sleep that night, you felt a faint, almost imperceptible touch on your hand. You looked down and saw a small, faint handprint on your skin. It was Emily's, you were sure of it. She was thanking you one last time. You smiled, a sense of closure washing over you. The Watcher was gone, Emily was free, and you could finally move on. But as you drifted off to sleep, you couldn't help but wonder, had you really destroyed the Watcher completely? Or was there still a fragment of its power, lurking somewhere in the shadows, waiting for its next victim?